This is Dr. Gary Kellner, and I'd like to welcome you to Fair Game. Most Americans have very little faith in Congress. If they are frustrated with presidents, they are usually more frustrated with the Congress, where they see sharp partisan divisions. And it seems as if the leadership in one party is often committed to the failure of the leader of the opposite party when he is in the White House. I thought one of the most shameful comments ever made by a House Majority Leader was made by Senator Mitch McConnell of Kentucky when he said that his objective was to cause Barack Obama's presidency to fail. Now, he's not the only one to believe that. He's not the only one to practice it. I suppose we should give him points for acknowledging it. But that is not what the founders had in mind when they established this form of government. In fact, it would surprise most Americans that the notion of political parties has no place in the Constitution. The founders feared what they called factions, that is, competing ideologies that would become enemies. What they hoped for was that the legislative branch, what they envisioned to be the first branch of government, would be a place where the issues confronting the United States could be discussed in a sober and thoughtful manner and come to some kind of a consensus. That was a noble idea, but it didn't last very long, because in President Washington's cabinet, he had two highly gifted, creative, and competitive personalities. The one is Alexander Hamilton, who was the Secretary of the Treasury, and whose vision of the government was of a strong central government that would support the business development of the nation. He believed that if America was to have its place in the family of nations, it would have to establish credit. It would have to establish a vibrant economy. Thomas Jefferson, of course, the great philosopher of the Revolution, he didn't know much about business. That was demonstrated by the fact that shortly after his death, his family had to sell his plantation of Monticello because it was swimming in debt, or more accurately, drowning in debt. Jefferson had a different vision of America, a nation of sturdy, independent, small farmers, an economy that was not held hostage to bankers. You kind of feel like it's the sort of speech you might have heard at Woodstock. Well, these two strong, creative, and competitive personalities competed with each other right from the start. The one group that followed Hamilton became known as the Federalists. They were the advocates of a strong central government. Jefferson, who was suspicious of strong central government, they were at times called Jeffersonians, at other times they were called Democratic Republicans. But that was the genesis of our two-party system. And had George Washington not been the president, it would have torn that administration apart. But because of his stature, because of his wisdom, he was able to keep his two very talented lieutenants at bay. But when Washington went off the scene, very quickly the lines hardened. And though they have gone by different names, America has had a series of political parties over the last 230 years. At times it gets really nasty, often during the time of presidential elections, sometimes during wars. And it has forced America to come to terms with something that the founders never imagined, and that was an opposition. What is the role of the opposition when they have lost a national election when perhaps they have lost control of the Congress or they have lost control of the White House. What is their role? Are they supposed to put on cheerleading uniforms and support anything and everything that the president sends up the pole? That is not what the founders had in mind for the role of the executive. The role of the executive is to faithfully execute the laws of the United States of America. They never saw the executive as a significant change agent. It might be better to think of him as a kind of chairman of the board. He certainly had powers. They were not carefully enumerated in the Constitution. It took a few generations to work it out. But in our history, the party that's out of power is usually and normally critical of the president and his program. We all understand it. I think we all accept it. The question is, are there boundaries? Well, we had a problem with that too. When Mr. Jefferson ran against John Adams in 1800, there was a scurrilous newspaper editor from Virginia who had dirt on Jefferson's relationship with Sally Hemings. Well, it all happened to be true. He did have children by Sally Hemings, and this man had the bad grace to publish these. We now know that it was with John Adams' full knowledge. You know, when there's a contest for power, there really aren't many virgins in the room. It upset the friendship of those two men for more than a decade. And it injected a venom and a rancor into the politics of the era that actually nearly caused the secession of New England during the War of 1812. It did cause attempted secession of the South in 1860 and 1861. What is the role of the opposition? Well, I think if you look at the way we're designed and the way laws are supposed to be adopted, a bill is placed before the House of Representatives for consideration, and the Speaker, if he deems it worthy, will refer it to a committee where it will be thoroughly examined, it will be discussed, it will be researched. As our democracy has developed, people will come and give testimony. That's a pretty good system. It allows for a full airing of views. And since none of us are perfect, and since none of us have crystal balls that work 100% of the time, quite often in the passion of the moment, the party in power will push forward an agenda that really isn't very good for the country. For example, in Mr. Adams' term, France and England were at war. And there was great fear in this country of aliens, of foreign immigrants who would be pro-French and in favor of the excesses and the violence of the French Revolution. So the Federalists in Congress jammed through a series of laws called the Alien and Sedition Acts, which made it illegal to criticize the president or the party in power. And there were people who were actually arrested and convicted under the Alien and Sedition Acts. It didn't take long for the American people to realize those really were not a good idea. And even someone of Mr. Adams' intelligence and integrity, also a cantankerous temperament, could use the government to suppress dissent. Throughout most of our history, the role of the opposition is to question, is to challenge, is to offer other alternatives. because we're human beings. And the philosopher Immanuel Kant, whose father was a Lutheran pastor, wrote famously that nothing straight can be made from so crooked a timber as humanity. You know, there is a cussed streak in all of us. And all of us at times get carried away by our emotions. That's not a problem to the country most of the time, unless the person getting carried away is the chief executive. Andrew Jackson being a notorious example of a president with a terrible temper, and who used that temper and the power of his office to make life hard for his opposition. The Congress, in fact, had established a banking system, and it was called the Second Bank of the United States. Jackson hated banks. Most farmers hate banks. He hated the East. I think he hated God for creating the East. And he was determined to destroy the bank. It was a personal vendetta. It didn't have anything to do with economic policy. He succeeded. And for the next generation or more, we often had chaos. What is the role of the opposition? It reminds me of one of my favorite stories out of West Africa and the Maori culture. And every time the king has a birthday, everybody comes out and makes windy speeches about how great the king is, how wise the king is, what a benevolent ruler he is. Well, toward the end of the day, a man comes forward named the Seti. The Seti is a little bit like a trash comic on cable television. And he stands up and insults the king's manhood, criticizes everything the king has ever done, throws dirt on himself, mocks the king shamelessly. By Maori tradition and law, you can't touch the Seti, because somebody has to remind the king that he is not a god. And there is the role of the opposition. It is crucial in a democracy. Now, what we hope for is that the members of the opposition will conduct themselves with a certain measure of dignity and respect for the other side. In the best days of our republic, and I think some of those best days were in the years of the Cold War, where Republicans and Democrats recognized that they disagreed on domestic policy, but they better cooperate together to counter the threat of the Soviet Union. That was the era in which the saying, politics stops at the water's edge, was coined. There was an opposition. Senator Vandenberg of Michigan had been a newspaper editor before he went to Washington, and he could give Franklin Roosevelt migraines. And yet, no one worked more closely with the Democratic leadership or with President Truman on matters of national security than Arthur Vandenberg. Sometimes it's the role of the opposition to bury the hatchet or bury your own personal agenda for the good of the nation. Vandenberg and a whole generation of Republicans did that. And in these days where we are so fraught with rancor, with vitriol, with wild and baseless charges from people who know better, and if they don't, they should know better. We need an opposition. We need to remind the president that he is not a god and he is not a king, that his actions are subject to public scrutiny and to debate. If the opposition does that, it fulfills a crucial role in our republic. This is Dr. Gary Kellner. Thank you for joining us today for Fair Game.